when I talk to people about doing the future authoring program, they often put it off. And it's not surprising because it's hard. But it's more than that. They think, well, I don't know how to write. I'm going to do a bad job. I don't really like assignments. I'm going to have to do it perfectly. I need to wait till I have enough time. And like one of those is enough to stop you cold, and all 5 of them, you're just done. And so I tell people, do it haphazardly, a tiny bit at a time, and badly. Because you can do that. I tell my students when they're doing their thesis, master's thesis, write a really bad first draft. And then we have a little conversation about that because they don't think I mean that. Because it sounds like a cliche in some sense. It's not a cliche. It's not a cliche at all. It means you're a terrible writer. But if someone put a gun to your head and said, you have to have your 100-page thesis done by next Monday or I'll shoot you, but I don't care how terrible it is, you would sit down and write it. And the thing is, then you have it, right? Then you have something, and then you can fix it. You can iterate and fix it. That bad first draft, that's the most valuable thing. And so that's what you need. You need a bad first draft of yourself. And there's an idea that Jung developed about the trickster and the jester, the comedian, right? That the trickster is the precursor to the savior. That's one of the things I learned from Jung that was just, it's so unlikely. You'd never think that. It's so amazing that might be the case. But the satirical and the ironic and the troublemaker, the comedian, the fool is the precursor to the savior. Why? Because you're a fool when you start something new. And so if you're not willing to be a fool, then you'll never start anything new. And if you never start anything new, then you won't develop. And so the willingness to be a fool is the precursor to transformation. And that's the same as humility. And so if you're going to write your destiny, you can do a bad first job. You're going to get smarter as you move forward. That's the thing, is that so something beckons to you. That's what happens here. Maybe the star that Geppetto wished on was the wrong damn star. But at least it was a star, right? At least it was in the sky. At least it moved him forward. And so you say in your life, well, something grips you and fills you with interest. And you think, well, should I do that? And the answer is, if not that, then something. What if it's a mistake? It's a mistake. Rest assured. What do you know? You're going to stumble around, right? And what's going to happen is this. You're going to not stay in stasis. You're not going to wander around in circles. And I see people like that. They said, well, I never knew what to do, and now I'm 40. It's like, that's not so good. That's not so good. And you might say, well, and there is a literature, too, that suggests that people are a lot more unhappy when they look back on their lives about the things they didn't do than they are about the mistakes they made while they were doing things. And so that's really worth thinking about, too, because there's redemptive mistakes. And a redemptive mistake would be a mistake that you make when you go out and try to do something. You think, okay, I'm going to try to do this. And you're not good at it. You make a bunch of mistakes. It's like, what's the consequence? If you pay attention, you're not quite so stupid anymore. That's the thing, is you've been informed by the results of your errors. And so what happens is you follow the beacon, you follow the light. And you're blind, so you don't know where the light is. It's dimly apprehended only, and you're afraid to follow it. But you decide to take some stumbling steps towards it. And as you take stumbling steps towards it, you become illuminated and enlightened and informed because of the nature of your experience, because you're pushing yourself beyond where you are, and you're going into the country that you have not yet been in, and you learn something. And so what happens then is the star moves. You move 10 feet towards it, and you think, no, that's not right. I didn't get it right. It isn't there. It's actually there. And so then you see it somewhere else, and you shift yourself slightly, and you move forward. And that's what happens, is that you continue as you change. The thing that guides you forward moves, right? It's like God in the desert in Egypt. The pillar of light that you're following, it's moving. It's not a permanent thing. You move towards it, it moves away. It guides you forward. And so you say, well, is what I'm aiming at paradise itself? And the answer to that is no, because what do you know? You couldn't see paradise if it was right in front of you, but you might get a glimmer of it. And so you move towards it and you grow. And then the next time you open your eyes, you see a little bit more clearly. And that's what happens, is that just happens over and over, right? It keeps moving. And so you move like this. But the thing that's so cool is that all those zigs and zags, you say, and each of those zags and zigs is a catastrophe. I hit a wall, my God, and then I had to die a little bit, and I barely got back up. It's a phoenix transformation at each turn, and it's painful. But the thing is that even though you've traveled 20 miles, let's say, on that road, and you've only moved 3 miles forward, you've moved 3 miles forward instead of falling backwards, because that's the thing too, is that if you stand still, you fall backwards. You cannot stand still, because the world moves away from you if you stand still. And there's no stasis, there's only backwards. And so if you're not moving forwards, then you're moving backwards. And that's more of the underlying truth of the Matthew principle. To those who have everything, more will be given. From those who have nothing, everything will be taken. It's a warning. Do not stay in one place. Well, as you zig and zag, maybe the cataclysm of each transformation starts to lessen. There's not so much of you that has to die with every mistake. And maybe you end up oriented at least reasonably properly. And if you were sensible, that would have been your trip. But it wasn't, right? It's that. And perhaps it's a lot worse than that. Perhaps there's no shortage of backtracking, but it doesn't matter, because as you stumble forward, you illuminate and inform yourself. And perhaps that's partly because the world is made of information. And if you encounter it and tangle with it, then it informs you. And then you become informed. And then you're information. And then you're ready.
Everyone knows that we have social identities and ideological identities. They're religious, they're cultural, they're intellectual, whatever. But nobody's really paid much attention to studying how the representations of that cultural identity alter the manner in which we feel emotion, in which we perceive, and by which we act. I'm interested in how our internal representations of our culture modulate our emotional expression. That's the best way to put this. You know, your brain basically is programmed as you're socialized. That's what socialization is for. Obviously, it's socialization that instills cultural identity. And equally obviously, the process of socialization that leads to cultural identity must have some impact on the way you think, and obviously equally on the way that your mind functions and the way that your brain functions. And see, North American neuropsychologists have been loath to give any consideration to this sort of notion, to think that cultural transformations might have some direct impact on physiological functioning. But the Russians, by contrast, this has been a central tenet of their neuropsychological theories basically since day one. This is particularly true with regard to Alexander Luria and Vygotsky. Now, you can think about this, it's quite obvious if you think about it for a second, with regards to something like the capacity to read silently. Now, it is the case that, well, this is a relatively new talent. I mean, literacy is a new talent, right? Most people weren't able to read 500 years ago. It's only been 500 years, and only for a little bit of that the capacity to read has been widespread. And the capacity to read silently is a relatively new development in human history. Now, it's a peculiar thing if you think about it, that nonetheless, the capacity to read silently localizes to a specific part of the brain, which is to say, it's as if you have a part of the brain that's evolved for that purpose. It's the same place in everybody, more or less. There are individual variations. There are differences when people are lateralized differently, but all that aside, if you learn to silent read, there's a part of your brain that specializes for that, and it's pretty much the same place in everyone, and it wasn't there, or it wasn't doing that sort of activity 2,000 years ago. In fact, I read at one point, I don't know where the reference to this is, like so many things that I make reference to, but I read at one point that people thought Julius Caesar was a magician, in part, I mean, he was obviously a remarkable person, but in part because he could read silently. He didn't have to read aloud. So it wasn't just reading that was remarkable, it was being able to read without talking. Anyways, the point of all this is that your brain, this is Luria's view of brain fundamentally, is your brain is an organ that produces suborgans, culturally specific suborgans. That's its remarkable capacity, is that it can generate new modules that are specialized for certain tasks as a consequence of environmental programming. Well, this is an interesting sort of notion, which is to say that at some level of physiological analysis, at least, your culture determines how your brain works. Now, it's very plastic. Your brain's very plastic when you're a child. You can sustain immense amounts of cortical damage in childhood and still grow up normally. For example, if you're very, very epileptic as a child, sometimes what surgeons will do is take out a whole hemisphere, the whole right hemisphere, gone. And children who have hemispherectomies, if they're done young enough, still grow up to be relatively normal. Quite normal, in fact. And there are other cases too where people are hydrocephalic, which basically means that their ventricles don't vent properly. And cerebral spinal fluid builds up in the skull, so these people often have skulls that are slightly larger than normal, not necessarily obvious, but still the case. And they end up with a skull that's essentially full of liquid with a very, very thin layer of brain tissue around this ball of liquid. And there are a number of case reports of people who have like 5% of the cortical tissue intact who have high functioning intelligence as normal personality. So the point is, especially the higher cortical levels of your brain are very, very functionally flexible in childhood. Now, by the time you're an adult, the pattern changes a little bit. It kind of looks like your brain dies into its adult configuration. That's an interesting thing to look at, which is to say, you have way more neurons than you need, especially right before you're born. And environment prunes your brain down to its adult configuration. So, although of course you develop connection as well, but you lose a lot of neurons. So, and by the time you're an adult, your brain is nowhere near as flexible as it was when you were a child. And if you sustain damage to certain parts of your brain that are already specialized, well, then you have the damage and you can work around all that, but it can still be really permanent. Question.
So that's sort of Lamarckian in its...
Yeah, that's right. That's a good comment.
Because the brain adapts, whereas the body...
Yeah, that's a great comment. And if you start thinking about that, it has really revolutionary implications. So you can say, for example, if I have an idea that's really radical and say, in a sense, that changes the configuration of my cortex, I can transmit that, maybe not to you, maybe your brain is already fixed, so to speak, but down the generations and alter the structure of brains henceforth. So you could say, well, ideas can spread throughout a population that way. That's a Lamarckian spread. But even more interestingly, I think, is, and this is speculative, of course, but let's say that there are certain types of revolutions in thought that are actually the consequences of biological mutations. So you could say that, well, you're a particularly odd sort of person from the genetic perspective, and as a consequence, you think in a very, very unique manner. But the thing that's so interesting is that if you can still communicate those thoughts, then the effect of that genetic mutation can be transmitted throughout the population without any biological alteration at the genetic level at all. So that's really something that's interesting, because it means that the consequence of genetic mutations on cognition can spread throughout the population as fast as communication can move. So that's, the Lamarckian, does everybody know what Lamarckian transmission is? Well, Lamarck was the character who thought that the reason that you could transmit acquired characteristics. So the reason giraffes have long necks is because they kept trying to stretch their necks, basically, and they transmitted the capacity to do the stretching to their offspring. So you could transmit acquired characteristics down the genetic line. Now, you can't do that. That's wrong, but that's what Lamarck thought. But he wasn't completely wrong, because that is how this sort of transmission works. It's non-genetically mediated accumulation of biological resources.